November 19th, 1961. The Arafura Sea. Somewhere off the southwestern coast of Dutch New Guinea, a 23-year-old man stands on the hull of an overturned catamaran, staring at a green smudge of jungle 12 miles away. The water around him is black and warm. The current is pulling him further out. Behind him, a Dutch anthropologist lies exhausted on the hull, begging him to wait. In front of him, sure. He believes he can make it. He straps 2 empty gasoline cans to his body. He turns to Rene Wassing one last time. "I think I can make it," he says. And then Michael Rockefeller, son of the governor of New York, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in American history, slides into the sea. He is never seen again. But decades later, deep inside a village that colonial authorities tried to forget, investigators would uncover a truth so disturbing that governments had actively buried it. And it has nothing to do with the ocean. Michael Clark Rockefeller was born on May 18, 1938, into a dynasty that had shaped the modern world. His grandfather, John D. Rockefeller, built Standard Oil into the largest corporation in American history. His father, Nelson Rockefeller, was the sitting governor of New York, a man who would later serve as vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford. Michael grew up in the kind of wealth that most people can barely imagine: the family estate at Pocantico Hills, the Fifth Avenue apartment, the private schools, the summer homes. By every conventional measure, his future was mapped. Politics, perhaps. Finance. The family name carried its own gravity. But Michael Rockefeller had a different center of gravity entirely. At Harvard, he studied social anthropology, the science of understanding how human societies organize themselves, what they believe, what they create. He wasn't interested in the boardroom. He was interested in the margins of the world, the places the modern age had not yet consumed. In 1961, fresh out of Harvard at 22 years old, he joined a film expedition to Dutch New Guinea, the western half of the island of Papua, then a Dutch colonial territory, one of the most remote and least documented regions on the planet. He spent weeks among the Dani people in the highland valleys, filming, collecting, absorbing. When the expedition ended, he did not go home. He had found what he was looking for, or so he believed. He stayed on, joining Dutch anthropologist Adrian Gerbrands to travel to the Asmat region on the southwestern coast, where he intended to collect ceremonial carvings and tribal artwork for his father's institution, the Museum of Primitive Art in New York City. The Asmat were renowned carvers. Their work was extraordinary: towering ancestor poles called bis poles, carved shields, ceremonial drums. Michael was captivated. What he did not fully understand, what perhaps no outsider fully understood, was the world he was walking into. The Asmat people of southwestern New Guinea had lived in their river delta world for thousands of years, a landscape of mangrove swamps, tidal channels, and dense jungle that the outside world had barely penetrated before the 20th century. Their culture was extraordinarily sophisticated, built around a cosmology in which the spiritual and physical worlds were not separate. The dead remained present. The murdered demanded justice. And the cycle of life was maintained through ritual acts that outsiders found disturbing: headhunting, and in certain ceremonial contexts, the consumption of enemies killed in battle. These weren't acts of savagery, as Dutch and later Indonesian colonial administrators portrayed them. They were expressions of a deeply structured belief system in which taking an enemy's head, and sometimes more, transferred that person's spiritual power to the community, and in doing so restored a balance that violence had disrupted. The Dutch colonial administration had spent decades attempting to suppress these practices. By 1961, official headhunting had been largely curtailed, at least in its most visible forms. Missionaries had established outposts, patrol officers moved through the region. But the Asmat world did not simply stop being the Asmat world because outsiders told it to. The beliefs ran deep, the obligations ran deeper. And 3 years before Michael Rockefeller arrived in that region, the Dutch colonial administration had done something to the Asmat people of one particular village, something that created an obligation so profound, so binding under their cultural law, that it could not simply be walked away from. That village was called Ochjanep, and Michael Rockefeller had visited it. On November 17, 1961, Michael Rockefeller and Rene Wassing set out by catamaran along the southern Asmat coast, accompanied by 2 local guides named Leo and Simon. They were heading for the village of Otsej, a route they were familiar with. The morning weather was manageable, but the Arafura Sea is unpredictable and unforgiving. By the time the currents shifted that afternoon, it was too late. The twin-hulled catamaran was caught broadside, capsized by the surging water, and all 4 men were thrown into the sea. They clung to the overturned hull as the current carried them further from shore. That night, Leo and Simon made the decision to swim. They were strong. They knew these waters and they made it to shore safely. They raised the alarm. But by the following morning, with no rescue vessel in sight and the catamaran still drifting steadily outward, Michael Rockefeller made his own calculation. He was a strong swimmer. He had the gas cans. Shore was approximately 12 miles away. He had been in the water for hours already, and the sun was rising. He believed he could do it. Wassing pleaded with him to stay. Michael's last confirmed words were spoken to Wassing before he slipped beneath the surface and began swimming. Wassing was eventually rescued by a Dutch patrol boat roughly 12 hours later, cold, dehydrated, and shaken, but alive. The search that followed was, by any measure, extraordinary. Nelson Rockefeller flew to New Guinea personally within days. Michael's twin sister Mary was also part of the family presence there. The Dutch colonial navy and air force mounted an extensive operation. Boats, aircraft, hundreds of miles of coastline searched. Asmat villages were visited and questioned. The water, the mangrove channels, the beaches were combed repeatedly. No body was recovered. No clothing, no gasoline cans. Not a single item belonging to Michael Rockefeller was ever found. The official Dutch conclusion was drowning, perhaps a shark. The sea had taken him, an accident, a tragedy, the kind of random cruelty that the ocean is capable of. The Rockefeller family accepted a death certificate in 1964, and for a long time that was the story. But there were people who never quite believed it, and not without reason. 12 miles is a significant swim, but not an impossible one for a fit young man in warm water with flotation. Strong ocean currents do move in unpredictable directions. It is entirely plausible that Michael Rockefeller reached the Asmat shoreline. The question is, what happened when he got there? To understand that question, you have to go back to 1958. 3 years before Michael disappeared, a Dutch colonial patrol led by Officer Wim van de Waal traveled to the village of Oud-Genep. The precise reasons are recorded differently in different accounts, but the outcome is not disputed. Dutch forces killed 5 Asmat men from Oud-Genep. Among those killed were individuals of significant spiritual and social standing in the community, men whose deaths reverberated through Asmat society at every level. Under the law of the Asmat world, those deaths created an obligation. Not a moral suggestion, a law. The souls of men killed violently cannot rest until their deaths have been answered. The community of Oud-Genep had been living under the weight of that unresolved debt for 3 years, and now consider what Michael Rockefeller had done in the weeks before his disappearance. He had visited Oud-Genep. He had traded there. He was a known face and he was a white face, a representative in Asmat eyes of exactly the colonial authority that had killed their men. When the people of Oud-Genep looked at Michael Rockefeller, they may not have seen an art collector from New York. They may have seen the debt finally arriving on their shore. This was not simply a theory invented after the fact. There were signals along the way that something was being suppressed. As early as the 1960s, Dutch colonial officials in the region had access to information suggesting that Michael Rockefeller had not simply drowned. Documents circulated within the Dutch colonial administration hinted at what had taken place near Oud-Genep. Officials in The Hague faced an extraordinary diplomatic and political calculation. If a member of the Rockefeller family, son of the governor of New York, one of the most powerful political dynasties in America, had been killed by an Asmat community, the implications were enormous. Colonial violence against the Asmat would be part of the story. Dutch administration of New Guinea would be called into question. American political pressure would be immediate and intense. It was easier, far easier, for the official record to say the sea had taken him. Safer for everyone, it seemed, except the truth. American anthropologist Tobias Schneebaum, who spent extended periods living among Asmat communities beginning in the 1960s, hinted in his writing that he had received accounts from community members suggesting they knew what had happened to a white man on that coast. He never spoke about it directly in public for many years. The situation was complicated by his relationships with the very communities involved. But the suggestion lingered. The knowledge existed. It simply was not being shared with the outside world. What was needed was someone willing to go back, decades later, when the political stakes had changed, when the colonial administrators were gone, when the people who had been young adults in 1961 were now elderly, and ask the questions directly. That person was journalist Carl Hoffman. In 2012, Hoffman traveled to the Asmat region of what is now the Indonesian province of Papua. He spent months there, visiting villages, learning enough of the local language to conduct his own interviews, building the kind of trust that only time and presence can earn. He went to Oud-Genep. He spoke to elderly men and women who had been alive in 1961, who had been young adults when a white man was pulled from the water. What he gathered became the basis for his 2014 book, Savage Harvest: A Tale of Cannibals, Colonialism, and Michael Rockefeller's Tragic Quest for Primitive Art. The accounts Hoffman collected were not a single source. They were multiple independent witnesses, people who had no reason to coordinate their stories and every reason to stay silent, and their accounts converged in disturbing, specific ways. They described a white man who was found in the water near Ochinep, exhausted and helpless. They described what happened next. He was killed as a payback killing, a deliberate, ritually sanctioned act of retribution for the 5 Asmat men killed by Dutch forces in 1958. And they described what followed. His body was treated according to the traditional Asmat practice of ceremonially incorporating an enemy's power. This was not random violence. In the framework of Asmat belief, it was justice, the most complete and final form of justice their culture recognized. Hoffman was careful to note that he did not have a confession. He had no physical evidence. What he had was something harder to dismiss than either of those things, a pattern of consistent, convergent testimony from aging eyewitnesses in a community that had carried this secret for 50 years. The story they told was the same story, told separately, by people who had lived with it. Savage Harvest was published in 2014 and became an immediate sensation, reviewed in every major publication, debated in academic circles, and reigniting global attention on a case that had never truly closed. For the Rockefeller family, the book reopened something deeply painful. Mary Rockefeller Morgan, Michael's twin sister, acknowledged the research but said the family had long ago made peace with uncertainty. Nelson Rockefeller had died in January 1979, never having learned with any certainty what happened to his son. The Dutch government, for its part, maintained its official position. Michael Rockefeller drowned. No formal reinvestigation was opened. The colonial-era archives in the Netherlands remain a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Multiple researchers have argued that those sealed files contain documentation, patrol reports, administrative communications, showing that Dutch officials in 1961 had a much clearer picture of events near Ochinep than they ever disclosed publicly. Whether those archives will ever be fully opened remains an open question. For the Asmat people, the story occupies a complicated space. The village of Ochinep still exists. The generation that lived through 1961 has almost entirely passed now. The accounts that Carl Hoffman gathered represent what may be the last window into living memory of that November. Younger generations in the Asmat region have largely grown up under Indonesian administration, within a very different cultural and political framework. The practice of ritual payback killing has not been part of public Asmat life for decades. But the history of what colonial violence did to that community, 5 men killed by a Dutch patrol, a debt that their culture demanded be answered, that history is documented, real, and largely unacknowledged by the governments that caused it. Michael Rockefeller went into the water 12 miles from shore on November 19, 1961. He was 23 years old. He had spent his short life drawn to places the modern world had barely touched, to the art and the rituals and the deep structures of cultures that were vanishing even as he tried to document them. There is a brutal irony buried in that. A man who went to the Asmat world to honor its artistry, to carry its carvings back to New York so that the rest of the world could see their beauty, may have died inside the logic of the very culture he was trying to celebrate. Not because he was a bad person, not because the Asmat people were monsters, but because the world he stepped into was governed by laws he didn't understand, in the aftermath of a violence he had no part in, and the colonial system that created that violence had erased him from the record to protect itself. Is that what happened? The honest answer is, we don't know. We have testimony. We have patterns. We have the weight of convergent accounts from people who were there. We have colonial archives that have never been opened. We have a Dutch government that has never answered for what its patrol officers did in Ochinep in 1958. And we have a family that buried an empty casket and called it closure. What we don't have is certainty. And in true crime, the cases that haunt us most are never the ones with clean endings. They're the ones like this, where the closer you look, the more you see the shape of something terrible that powerful people chose to look away from. If this case keeps you up at night like it does me, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, and drop your theory in the comments. Do you think Michael Rockefeller made it to shore? And if he did, do you think the truth will ever be officially acknowledged?